The night was alive with the hum of champagne glasses clinking and the soft murmur of high society chatter. Nathan Parker, a millionaire known for his icy demeanor and unshakable confidence, stood on the balcony of his lavish penthouse overlooking the city. The party inside was a testament to his wealth and influence, but Nathan was bored. Money had lost its thrill, and the people around him were nothing more than pawns in a game he had long mastered. That was until Michael Carter, an old friend with a penchant for stirring trouble, approached him with a glass of wine in hand and a mischievous glint in his eye. "Nathan," Michael began, his tone dripping with challenge, "you always say money can buy anything, right?" Nathan raised an eyebrow, his expression indifferent. "Because it can." Michael smirked and pointed to the sidewalk below, where a young woman sat hunched over, her worn-out clothes and weary gaze a stark contrast to the opulence of the party above. "See her? She's your next challenge. I bet $2 million you can't turn her into a high-society lady and stay married to her for 3 months. Nathan's eyes narrowed as he studied the woman. She was nothing more than a beggar, a shadow in the city's glittering landscape. But the challenge intrigued him. He had never backed down from a bet, and this one was no different. "You're on," Nathan said, a cynical smile forming on his lips. "But don't come crying to me when you lose." Minutes later, Nathan found himself standing just steps away from the young woman. Her disheveled hair framed a face marked by exhaustion, yet there was a silent strength in her eyes that intrigued him. She held a piece of cardboard with crooked writing. "Anything helps." "Excuse me," Nathan said, his tone more of a command than a request. The woman looked up, startled. Her blue eyes, dulled by hardship, met his. "What do you want?" she asked wearily, shrinking further into herself. Nathan offered a smile that blended condescension and curiosity. "I have a proposition for you, something that could change your life." She frowned, suspicion etched across her face. "I'm not anyone's guinea pig, Mr. Millionaire." Nathan ignored her sharp tone and pressed on with cold precision. "I'm willing to pay generously. You'll have food, clothes, a place to stay. All you need to do is marry me for 3 months." The woman blinked, incredulous. "You must be joking." "I don't joke about business," Nathan replied firmly. "It's simple, a marriage of convenience. No real commitment. After 3 months, we part ways and you walk away with more money than you've ever imagined." She sat in silence for a few moments, processing the absurd proposal. Her life had been a string of downward spirals since losing everything, yet something about Nathan's authoritative tone irritated her deeply. "Why me?" she finally asked. "Because you're here," Nathan replied bluntly. The woman hesitated, the weight of hunger and cold keeping her rooted in place. Finally, she sighed and nodded. "All right." The next morning, Emily Clark, the young woman from the streets, awoke in a luxurious hotel suite. The plush carpets, refined wooden furniture, and stunning view of the city were a far cry from the cold, hard sidewalk she had called home just hours before. Nathan had wasted no time. He had arranged for a team of stylists, etiquette instructors, and even a posture coach to begin Emily's transformation. The goal was clear: to turn her into a high-society lady who could pass as Nathan's wife. The days that followed were grueling for Emily. From early morning, she endured endless clothing fittings, etiquette lessons, and posture drills. Though she despised the superficiality of it all, she began to notice herself adapting to the new environment. Nathan, meanwhile, kept his distance but couldn't ignore the impact Emily was having on the household. She wasn't like the other women he had known. She didn't bow to his authority, and her sharp tongue often left him speechless. One afternoon, as Emily practiced walking gracefully across the grand hall, Nathan entered and watched in silence. When she noticed him, she stopped and crossed her arms. "Enjoying the show?" she asked with sarcasm. Nathan gave a small smile. "Just assessing your progress. You're doing well," Emily scoffed. "Glad my performance meets your approval, Mr. Parker." Nathan stepped closer, stopping just a few feet away. "Why does it always feel like you're ready to attack me?" Maybe because you deserve it, she replied without hesitation. Nathan paused, surprised by her honesty. Then he took a step back and changed the subject. Get ready, we're going out tonight. Where? Emily asked suspiciously. A private dinner at a restaurant. I want to see how you handle yourself in public. That evening, Nathan and Emily arrived at one of the most upscale restaurants in the city. Emily, wearing an elegant dress, drew admiring glances but felt uncomfortable under the attention. Nathan, however, appeared completely at ease. During dinner, Nathan noticed that Emily was nervous. Her gaze shifted frequently and she fidgeted with the strap of her dress. Relax, he said in a low voice. You're doing a great job. Emily looked up, surprised by his encouraging tone. I'm not used to any of this. Nathan leaned forward slightly. You'll adapt. Trust me. For a moment, Emily saw something different in his eyes. He wasn't the cold, calculating man she'd met before. There was something more human, almost vulnerable. After dinner, on the ride back to the mansion, the atmosphere in the car was lighter. Nathan commented on her behavior during dinner, pointing out small improvements she could make, but without his usual critical tone. You're really taking this seriously, aren't you? Emily asked, curious. Nathan glanced at her from the corner of his eye. I always take my bets seriously. The mention of the bet made Emily tense. She still didn't know exactly what Nathan stood to gain from all this, but the idea of being just a pawn in some game left a bitter taste in her mouth. Later that night, while alone in her room, Emily decided to explore the mansion. She wandered through the quiet hallways until she came across a slightly open door leading to an office. Inside, a massive wooden desk was covered with documents and papers. Curious, Emily approached and began to look through the papers. Among contracts and financial reports, she found something that made her blood run cold. A printed conversation between Nathan and another man discussing the details of the bet. So, has she agreed? One message read. Yes, it's only a matter of time before I win, Nathan's reply stated, the words dripping with indifference. Emily felt her stomach churn. She'd known there was more to Nathan's actions, but seeing the words in black and white made it all the more painful. Suddenly, the door opened and Nathan walked in. When he saw Emily holding the papers, his expression hardened. What are you doing in here? He asked, his voice low and tense. Emily stared at him, clutching the papers tightly. Is this how you see me? Just a bet to feed your ego? Nathan stepped closer, trying to take the papers, but Emily pulled back. Answer me, she demanded, her voice trembling with anger. Nathan sighed, running a hand through his hair. It's not as simple as it seems. Not simple? Emily let out a bitter laugh. You've toyed with my life like I'm some disposable object. Emily, Nathan began, but she cut him off. Don't you dare try to justify this, she shouted, throwing the papers onto the desk before storming out of the office. Nathan stood alone, staring at the scattered papers. For the first time in years, he felt as though he'd lost control. Emily could barely breathe as she rushed up the stairs, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst from her chest. Once inside her room, she locked the door and leaned against it, trying to calm herself. Discovering the bet had shattered any tolerance she'd built over the past few days. I can't stay here, she thought as tears of anger and humiliation streamed down her face. That night, while everyone slept, Emily put her plan into action. She dressed in simple clothes and packed a small bag with the few belongings she'd managed to gather since arriving at the mansion. Carefully, she opened the window, trying not to make a sound, and climbed down the trellis that held the mansion's rose vines. The cold night air enveloped her as she finally reached the ground. Emily looked back at the mansion's imposing silhouette against the night sky. Part of her wanted to scream, to make Nathan feel the pain she carried, but instead she turned and ran toward the road without looking back. Meanwhile, back at the mansion, Nathan woke early and noticed Emily's absence at breakfast. At first, he wasn't concerned, thinking she just needed space after the argument the night before. But when one of the staff mentioned they hadn't seen her since dinner, Nathan felt a chill run down his spine. Check her room, he ordered, trying to stay calm. A few minutes later, the butler returned with a worried expression. "Mr. Parker, the room is empty, and the window, it's open." Nathan immediately ran upstairs and entered Emily's room. The bed was untouched, and her clothes still hung in the closet. He walked to the window and saw marks on the trellis. "She ran away," he murmured, clenching his fists. Without wasting time, Nathan grabbed his phone and made several calls, reaching out to his contacts to try to find her. The thought of Emily wandering the streets alone unsettled him. He couldn't explain it, but something inside him was driving him to find her. Not because of the bet, but because of something new growing in his heart: regret. Hours later, with the sun high in the sky, Nathan finally found her. Emily was lying on a bench, curled up under a thin blanket someone had likely given her. Her face was pale and she was trembling with fever. "Emily!" Nathan called out, running toward her. She slowly opened her eyes, her unfocused gaze meeting his. "What are you doing here?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm here to take you home," he said, his voice firm but full of concern. "I don't have a home," she replied bitterly. Nathan picked her up, ignoring her weak attempts to resist, and carried her to the car. On the way to the hospital, he remained silent, his thoughts a whirlwind. He knew he'd need more than words to regain Emily's trust. At the hospital, the doctors confirmed that Emily was dehydrated and running a high fever. Nathan stayed by her side, watching her sleep as the medical staff cared for her. A heavy weight pressed on his chest. For the first time in years, he felt like he wasn't in control of his own life. Hours later, when Emily finally woke up, she found Nathan sitting by her bed. He looked exhausted, but his eyes were fixed on her. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice still weak. "Because I care," Nathan answered sincerely. Emily let out a faint laugh, her voice a mere whisper. "You don't know what it means to care about anyone but yourself." Nathan lowered his head, his hands gripping his knees. "Maybe you're right, but I'm trying to change." She watched him silently, unsure whether to believe him. Her mind was too tired to process his words. The next morning, Emily woke to the soft sound of footsteps entering the room. Still weak, she turned her head slowly and saw a nurse adjusting her IV. The sight was comforting, but also a stark reminder of her vulnerability. Nathan was nowhere to be seen, allowing her to relax a bit more. Not long after, the door opened and Nathan walked in, carrying a small paper bag. He was dressed casually, a rare sight given his usual formal attire. His eyes showed fatigue, but also determination. "I brought something for you," he said, placing the bag on the bedside table. Emily simply watched him without speaking. Nathan pulled up a chair and sat down, keeping a respectful distance. "It's soup. You need to regain your strength," he continued, opening the bag. "I don't want anything from you," Emily replied, her voice hoarse and cold. Nathan sighed but didn't push. He knew forcing anything now would be pointless. Instead, he stayed seated, letting the silence fill the room. "Why are you here, Nathan?" Emily finally asked, breaking the quiet. He hesitated before answering. "Because I care." Emily let out a bitter laugh. "You don't know what that means." Nathan leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Maybe you're right. Maybe I've spent my whole life not truly caring about anyone. But you made me see things I never wanted to face." She looked away, her hands gripping the bedsheet. "That doesn't change what you did." "I know," he said, his voice heavy. "And I don't expect you to forgive me anytime soon, but I'll prove that I can be different." Emily remained silent, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. She wanted to believe him, but the wounds were still too fresh. In the days that followed, Nathan stayed by Emily's side, ensuring she received all the care she needed. He coordinated with the doctors, made sure the food was to her liking, and even brought her books to help pass the time. Emily, though still resentful, couldn't ignore his efforts. One afternoon, as she flipped through one of the books Nathan had brought, she found something unexpected: a carefully folded letter tucked between the pages. It was handwritten in Nathan's firm script. Emily, I know words aren't enough to undo what I've done, but I need you to know I'm trying. I've never been someone who admits mistakes, but you've made me look in the mirror and see who I really am. I don't expect your forgiveness, but I want to become someone worthy of your respect. Nathan. Emily read the letter over and over, trying to decipher the intentions behind the words. Was there sincerity in them, or was this just another attempt to manipulate her? That night, when Nathan walked into the room, Emily held the letter up to him. "What is this?" she asked, her voice firm. Nathan glanced at the letter inside. "It's my attempt to be honest." Emily shook her head. "You used me, humiliated me. How can I believe anything you say?" Nathan stepped closer but kept a respectful distance. "I know I have no right to ask for your trust, but I'm here, and I'll stay here, even if it takes years for you to believe in me." Tears filled Emily's eyes, but she quickly blinked them away. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive you." Nathan nodded slowly. "I understand." The next day, the doctors informed Emily she was well enough to leave the hospital. Nathan wasted no time arranging everything to bring her back to the mansion. Emily, though reluctant, knew she had nowhere else to go. When they arrived at the mansion, Nathan surprised Emily with something she never expected. He had transformed one of the rooms into a small art studio, complete with canvases, brushes, and paints in every color. "What is this?" she asked, stunned. "You mentioned once that you liked painting," Nathan said with a shy smile. "I thought you might like a space of your own." Emily was speechless. It was a simple gesture, but one filled with meaning. For the first time, she saw something in Nathan beyond the arrogant billionaire. In the days that followed, Emily began spending more time in the studio, exploring her creativity. Painting gave her a sense of freedom, something she hadn't felt in years. Nathan, for his part, kept his distance, respecting her space while quietly ensuring her comfort. One afternoon, as Emily painted, Nathan appeared in the doorway, watching her in silence. "You're talented," he said at last. Emily paused, looking at him. "I didn't know you had an eye for art." Nathan shrugged, a faint smile on his lips. "I'm learning." She laughed for the first time in what felt like forever. The days at the mansion settled into a calmer rhythm. Emily spent most of her time in the art studio, while Nathan was occupied with his business affairs. There was a sort of truce between them, a fragile balance neither dared to disturb. But Nathan wasn't satisfied. He knew words alone wouldn't be enough to rebuild Emily's trust. He needed to take action to prove he was willing to change, not just for her, but for himself. One afternoon, Nathan entered the studio while Emily was focused on a new painting. He waited for her to notice him, but she kept working, deliberately ignoring him. "I need your help," he said finally, breaking the silence. Emily stopped, wiping her hands on a cloth. "My help?" Nathan nodded. "I want to start supporting social projects, and I think you can help me decide where to begin." She looked at him, skeptical. "Since when do you care about that?" "Since I realize the world doesn't revolve around me," he replied honestly. Emily hesitated for a moment. Despite her reluctance to trust him, the idea of doing something meaningful appealed to her. "All right," she said at last, "but I'm not doing this for you." "I wouldn't expect anything else," Nathan replied with a small smile. In the days that followed, Nathan and Emily began visiting charities and community projects. He took her to shelters, rehabilitation centers, and schools in underprivileged areas. During each visit, Emily noticed how Nathan interacted differently with people. He seemed genuinely interested in hearing their stories and understanding their needs. One visit was particularly impactful. They went to a shelter for women who had experienced domestic violence. While Emily talked with some of the residents, Nathan approached a young woman holding a baby. He crouched down to her level and began asking about her story. "It's hard to trust people after what I've been through," the young woman said, holding the baby tighter. Nathan nodded, his expression serious. "I understand." Emily, observing from a distance, was surprised. She hadn't expected Nathan to show such genuine empathy. On the way home, the car ride was heavy with silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Emily sensed that